It's no secret at this point that Bernie Sanders was getting the youth vote in spades. Based on, let's go to Super Tuesday, if we're looking at the number of people who Sanders was getting in the youth demographic, 18 to 29, 63% to 17. It was not even close. Even 34 to 44, Sanders was also winning that demographic. The younger in age, the more people that Sanders basically was bringing to his particular cause. Now, keep in mind, the reason he was bringing to this had nothing to do with Sanders from an identity standpoint. It had everything to do with what was coming out of his mouth and the fact that those people actually found him to be authentic. Meaning, whether he could get those policies exactly in the way that he said they could get those policies, they trusted him to actually try for it. There was no deviation from the standpoint of what they believed he would try to get versus what the policies were. Meaning, I'm saying that in a weird way. But basically what I'm trying to say is they believed that he will push for those particular policies. Whereas in many other cases, the politicians who they put in that office don't. They just don't. It tends to be rather shameless, actually. With Sanders, they found somebody who they consider to be relatively honest and authentic. And authentic in such a way where they fully believed him. Now, Joe Biden understands this. Which means if Joe Biden needs to get elected, he needs to somehow get a contingent of that vote tally and bring them into his camp. Meaning Sanders' most vociferous component of Sanders' base, these youngins, these youth vote, Joe Biden has to somehow get this youth vote, the most fickle part of the political space, who is not enthused with him at all, like zero enthusiasm, to back and somehow support him. In pursuit of this, Joe Biden has put out an ad. This ad is pathetic, insulting even. I mean, you can even make a point of saying that the ad is utterly and entirely tone deaf. It completely misses why lefties were backing Sanders. It completely misses why the youth vote was backing Sanders in the numbers that they were backing Sanders. It's as if they don't quite understand what makes lefties tick, and in lieu of not necessarily knowing that, they put out this particular ad. Like I said, I think this ad is pathetic and insulting, and I'm going to explain why I think this ad is pathetic and insulting. Welcome to Late Night Real Men Can't Sleep, Real Men Do the News Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support. PayPal, Patron. This content is indeed brought to you by you, and I thank you for the opportunity to allow me to do what I do. So, let's start here. Under the Obama administration, 95% of the jobs that were created were low wage or basically minimum wage or gig work. This was also commensurate with 95% of the income gains going to the top 1%, because after all, it was low wage work. These guys were gig workers. That wealth had to be going somewhere. Well, it was expropriated to the top. The younger generation is uniquely vulnerable for exploitation in this particular section of the capitalist system. You have a group that is either just getting out of school, maybe high school or college. They don't necessarily have the requisite experience to do anything where they could get a higher salary. And so oftentimes they are to some degree locked into various jobs in service work that just so happens to pay less. They are in the unique position of being stuck in this kind of horrible economic thicket while they are either pursuing their education or trying to maneuver into something else. We tell our kids in school, meaning from the standpoint of the parents and from the standpoint of principals, guidance counselors, we tell our kids, go to school. That the pathway to education is basically through you getting an education and coming away with that education and being able to pursue your dreams, being able to pursue some career that enthuses you, or for that matter, just being able to secure a living for yourself. Meaning that later on in life, you're going to have a certain degree of agency based on the nest that you feathered right now. Now, understand for the moment, though, that after instantiating that point of view, meaning after your society, after your authorities that your kids are dealing with pushes that particular point of view of go to school, go to school, go to school, this is your best chance, this is your best chance. You then have somebody who is looking to make a buck off of all of those fears and all of that consternation in regards to how they're going to make a living later on. And in the contract signed in their own blood, basically says, you are going to give me $50,000 and it's going to be more than that. But at the very least, let's start off at $50,000 and I'm going to give you the ability to get an education. This thing that you need and you covet in order to have somewhat of a decent life. Now, consider for the moment that the person who's getting an education, this education is not specific entirely to that person. Yes, that person is going to school. Yes, that person is bettering themselves in a sense of human development. But also, that person is going to get out of school and is going to be making higher wages, ideally. That person is going to be creating businesses, certain technical advances or business advancements. Meaning that person is going to directly contribute to the society as a whole, even beyond what that person is doing from the standpoint of their own career goals. The companies and politics, meaning the political space, absolutely and entirely requires this group to get educated. How are you going to fill those positions in your company? How are you going to fill those positions in government if you don't necessarily have those people getting an education in order to be able to fill those positions? The point I'm trying to make here is that the education that the individual is getting, despite us localizing most of the pain for that education onto the specific, onto the individual themselves. And again, the overwhelming majority of the population doesn't have $500 in a bank. And we're putting $550,000 on somebody's head at the ripe age of 17, 18 years old. I'm making the point that our companies, our political space, our society as a whole entirely requires people to go to school and get an education, and yet we isolate pretty much all of the pain specific to the individual. Why is that fair? Why is it morally okay to effectively create a predatory situation where you're going after kids, where you're trying to make a profit, they're trying to make a life? But on the second side of that, considering for the moment that our education or the education that people get is directly beneficial to the society itself, why on earth should that person have to cover that education? The government itself should be perfectly okay and getting rid of student debt, meaning getting this onerous burden off of our economic system. But beyond getting that burden off the economic system, opening a college, state colleges and universities free of cost. We should want as many people to go to school as possible. We should incentivize people going to school. Those things are to a benefit of our society. And again, our society thrives, lives and dies based off the level of education that we can get within the context of our population. We have been basically preying on various members of our society, on the most vulnerable element of our society, with the thought that basically they don't have a choice. They have nowhere else to go in this process if they want to get an actual education. That needs to stop. Now, Sanders basically made the argument, get rid of student debt and open up colleges and universities to be free of cost. That is directly related to the youth generation. Making the point of a $15 an hour minimum wage is directly related to the youth generation. Again, as I mentioned before, this is the class that can be most exploited because they have the least skill sets regarding them in the workforce. So saying that, yeah, even these workers who are just getting into the workforce should be able to have a decent wage where they can take and make a living for themselves. Considering that these guys are the lowest end of the economic scale, what Sanders is talking about, even beyond school and going into wages, directly benefits them materially. Go further, healthcare. Again, you have a situation where a large part of their salaries, the meager salaries that they are, gets put into paying a regressive healthcare tax. Like, I hope you understand what I mean. The reason that I'm making the point here, and I'm belaboring this point, is that the backing of Sanders had everything to do with benefits to that class. A youthful generation that effectively has been left behind that Sanders was directly speaking to regarding the policies that he was pushing and espousing. Those policies would have ameliorated much of the pain that these guys were feeling and operating in our society. Joe Biden in no way deals with that. This wasn't an issue of identity. This wasn't an issue of anything else. It wasn't because he was a man. It wasn't because he was Jewish. It wasn't none of that stuff. The left tends to be ideologically oriented. And if you have a situation where a candidate is articulating things that is going to benefit you, especially if it's dramatically going to benefit you, then yeah, you can understand where the enthusiasm is coming from. As opposed to no enthusiasm being on the other person that is marginally better than the Republican Party. Marginal doesn't necessarily get people out of their seats to back you, in which case you start to lose that component of the political space and thereby potentially losing the election. Joe Biden releases this ad. Tell me what's wrong with this ad, and tell me why it's bugging me so much that this ad exists in the context of everything that I've just told you. Meaning in the context of getting rid of this debt off these students' backs, upping their wages, in the context of ensuring that they all have health care without it eating entirely into their salaries. Like, all of these issues are directly related to their living situation. That's why they were backing Sanders. Now listen to the ad Joe Biden is putting out for outreach.
It's like outside. I was kind of just standing there on my phone. We all knew that he was coming out.
I was just like, "Hi, Vice President Biden, how are you?" Like, I was like freaking out.
And, like, I just hear like a roar, and then I was just like, "Oh my gosh!" You can kind of see him from like the very back of my selfie. It's been my Facebook profile picture for the last 4 years. It's not a very good picture of me, but it is a picture of me with Vice President Joe Biden.
I lived in Delaware all my life, so I grew up. You saw him at the grocery store getting some coffee on our college campus. I worked at the university, and he just came and he walked into my job, asked us a couple questions.
What's wrong with this video? Why am I annoyed at this video? With all of the pain and anguish that is dealt to the younger generation, all of the vulnerability, all of the uncertainty that's leveled onto that generation, even from the standpoint of climate. We're talking about a Green New Deal, and we're talking about jobs that are actually decent paying jobs as opposed to some of the jobs that were proliferated under Obama. But beyond the Green New Deal, they care about their society because they're going to be here in 40, 50 years when the worst or when the worsening environmental collapse becomes that much more obvious and that much more apparent. They care about all of these issues. All of these issues were things that Sanders was pushing for. This video has none of that. This video is a fanboy video. Oh, I was just so... Joe Biden just walked in and he shook my hand. I was so... Woo! He smelled my hair. I was so enthused by this. None of this has anything to do with policy. None of this has anything to do with addressing the pain that is taking place to this particular younger generation. None of that has anything to do with reaching out in real terms to Sanders supporters, meaning these guys, in order to get them to back and to give you their vote. You understand something for the moment. If the law allowed for companies to pay people $2 an hour, would companies, or would there be jobs where people get paid $2 an hour? And would there be people who are desperate and so desperate for a job that they will willing to accept this poverty wage, this desperate poverty wage, if it meant having some level of subsistence? The answer, of course, is yes. I mean, the reason we have minimum wage laws now is because companies basically will try everything they can to maximize their profit. And if that means they can have a race to the bottom regarding wages, they would have a race to the bottom regarding wages. You need a countervailing force in order to ensure that you don't necessarily go beyond a certain point. And you have many companies that end up just staying on that particular point. You can say the same thing about child labor. You can say the same thing about slavery. These laws are put into place because companies would do whatever they can to maximize their profit, and the grimier aspects of morality matter less. Consider for the moment that we choose, I would make the argument that politics is very similar. Meaning, in the way that we organize, unions are the thing that pushes back against corporate power in the political space. You have the workers themselves who organize and stand in a certain degree of solidarity about what they were willing to accept and what they wouldn't accept. And beyond certain levels, those workers will balk and walk. Yes, it damages the company, but the point is that it damages the company. We're not willing to accept X or Y in the situation. There are minimum levels that we're willing to exist, and you've just trespassed on that particular level. So yes, we're leaving, we're walking out, and yes, we're trying to damage the company in order to bring you back to the negotiation table. That's the entire point of being able to negotiate against the corporate interests. It's the assumption that a corporate body, if it was entirely unaccountable or was dealing with workers as individuals, will have such an uneven distribution of power that you could force down wages or have people doing things that wouldn't necessarily be otherwise would fly. I'm trying to make the point that your politics is very similar here. In the case of two inequitable powers, especially if one of those powers is able to be in a certain degree of unison, let's say the weaker party, well, that weaker party can negotiate and push to get concessions. The thing that that party leverages, however, it's its credibility and the credibility to dispose itself of whatever the stick is that it has. The weaker power, if nothing else, has the stick to basically make the stronger power lose. And if the weaker power is willing to use that stick to make the stronger power lose, and the stronger power knows that, that stronger power may be willing to make certain concessions. Now, Joe Biden offered the youth basically to get rid of some college debt. This is his least option, meaning what is the least that I can give you to try to get your vote? And a lot of this has to do with the perception of Biden in regards to how many from the youth demographic that he's going to need, how many he's already going to get, and what's the bare minimum, what's the penny that I can throw at these people in order to pull just enough to get me over the finish line. That's kind of like capitalism also. What's the cheapest burger that I can give people that they will be willing to spend 80 cents on and buy it? Will it cause cancer later on? Maybe. But what's the cheapest that I can do? That's my objective. The objective is profit. In this very specific case, the objective is power. Now, despite that, our political leaders on the left don't pay attention to politics in this exact same way. Even though they would deify unions, they wouldn't necessarily look at party politics in a similar fashion. Yes, the union takes a risk when it goes out and pushes against the corporate demands. But you, as a party on the left, also would take a risk pushing back against the party in order to enforce a certain degree of minimum standards of accountability. My point is, how are you okay with the union taking this risk, but you don't necessarily want to take this risk yourself? And if the union is the backstop on what level of subsistence we're willing to accept before we just balk and no longer participate in this process, then what is your backstop in the political space? What is your backstop in the political space if there is no accountability in your political space? Why is Joe Biden offering the college thing? And let me ask a secondary question. Why not offer Medicare for all and elimination of student debt entirely? Because keep in mind, whatever Joe Biden is offering here, that's the starting point. It is going to get whittled away from there. So what this ends up being, if he pushes for it in any real terms at all, is going to be far less than what he is pushing or saying it is going to be now. But why is it not Medicare for all? Why is it not an elimination of student debt as opposed to what he's pushing here? Because this supposedly is a concession. And if indeed it's a concession, why does the concession go further than what it is? I would point to you that Joe Biden is making an assumption that the left will not be willing to effectively turn over the entire apple cart in order to get what they want regarding policy. So because the left has functioned this way over the last 40, 50 years, Joe Biden makes the assessment that the least that I could give them, or the most, I can give them this and they'll be willing to basically accept it, even though it's not that much of an offering at all. If Joe Biden entirely believed that there was levels of accountability and that not accepting Medicare for all, not accepting college for all, or getting rid of student debt and making universities and state colleges free, tuition free, then he would back those. My point here is the reason that he doesn't back those, especially if Joe Biden really does indeed want to win, has issues to do with accountability. And because there's been no accountability, he has no real faith belief that the left will ever turn over the apple cart if it means Donald Trump could potentially take power. Last point. Bernie Sanders, when he was doing his video, with two last points. The demographic that the Democratic Party needs in order to win is the youth vote. Burners, right? In addition to needing this particular youth vote, it's just so happened that voters who make like under 30,000, meaning in poverty, and people who are people of color, they tend to vote less. Now, part of the reason they tend to vote less is because they're so dejected from the political system and not really returning anything in compensation for their vote that they tend to just pull away from it. They tend to no longer engage. The party, because it deifies or worships incrementalism, it effectively lost a large contingent of its typical base that would have typically kept that party in office. That's one point. The second point is that I want you to take a look at this video. Listen to what Sanders is saying here and notice the drastic difference in regards to what he is saying versus the clownish video that Joe Biden put out as, I suppose, as fig leaf. Notice the difference between these two videos. And this, I would make the point, is why they were backing Sanders. It wasn't magic. It was just issues of policy.
As you may have noticed lately, the establishment's getting a little bit nervous. Oh my God, they're putting together a multi-generational, multi-racial movement of millions of people. Oh my goodness, how can we stop them? How can we stop the workers who want higher wages? How can we stop the young people who want to go to college and not come out with debt? How can we stop the millions of people who understand that health care is a human right? How can we stop the people who know that we've got to take on the fossil fuel industry? So they're getting nervous, but you know what? When we stand up together, they ain't gonna stop us. Because all of you know that real change, if you go throughout American history and you think about it, real change has never ever taken place from the top on down, always from the bottom on up. You think back upon workers 100 plus years ago who had the guts to tell their employers they were not animals, they needed dignity, and they struggled to form unions.
They struggled to form unions. Why? To push back in a certain degree of solidarity against a unequal distribution of power between the corporation and them as individuals. By working in solidarity, they were able to get actual real material concessions from the corporate masters, the owner class. I'm making the point that the pathway to getting your political concessions is to do something similar, to be willing to say no, and to make it extremely and extraordinarily clear that this is no longer a race to the bottom. It's not so much that I'm enthused with this notion that Trump is winning, but there needs to be a certain degree of accountability in the political process if you are ever going to get what you want accomplished. Yes, just because you lose, or just because a party loses in a race, that doesn't necessarily mean that you lost, especially if you could start reorganizing the party into actually having some level of standards that it is very clear, almost as a word of God, law of nature, flat fact way, that not towing this particular policy or that particular policy will effectively have them to lose, and have that as an understanding going forward. Now you tell me, if the person wants to get elected and they understand that going forward that X policy or Y policy is utterly and entirely required to even have the premise of getting elected, do you think they will back those policies? Depends on the candidate, right? But ultimately, Joe Biden is throwing this fig leaf out there and saying, I'll do part of the thing because he accepts that, look, I want to do something to try to get this particular vote, even though it's not necessarily anything legit in real terms. I'm making a point that it would be legit in real terms if the party believed that there was some level of accountability. Also, Sanders making the point that movements are the thing that kind of push this stuff and never starts them down up. It never starts them down up because nobody in the top wants to give over power or give over concessions. They want to be able to run the table on that stuff. So until you get some level of a singular voice, there's nothing that they're going to concede. In his case, especially in the political space, we need to take a different tenor in the way that we've been doing politics over the last half century. We need to stand under this notion of policy. Pick 3 or 4 policies that you know are popular, that a large contingent of people, Republican, Independent, and Democrat, can fold themselves under. Has nothing to do with party. I don't care if you're Republican, Democrat, Socialist, whatever. I don't care. Do you agree with Medicare for all? Do you agree we should get rid of student debt? Do you agree that we should have public universities free of charge? Do you believe that we should increase wages to $15 an hour? Do you believe we should expand Social Security? If you do, the line starts here. And if you can get 1 million people backing you on that very specific point, that gives political power, especially if it was fully understood that that leverage would be used if what you're saying wasn't heeded. The catch here is any demand that doesn't have a consequence is just a suggestion. And those suggestions will be roundly ignored, especially with all of the pressures of cash that are pushing in the opposite direction. This video that Joe Biden put out was vapid, and yeah, I do consider it insulting. People have real problems, they have real concerns, they have things that bother them and dig into them, especially now in the middle of this pandemic. And to put out this kind of fanboy, no policy, not dealing with the real material interests of that particular group and that particular demographic in order to kind of con those voters to think that there's some kind of energy around Joe Biden with the youth vote. Yes, that's pathetic. And it gets across how empty and vapid Joe Biden's campaign is in regards to trying to offer, or in regards to offering anything to lefties. For those people who make this argument of one concentration camp less, you realize that in voting for one concentration camp less over the course of 20, 30 years, you still may have the same distribution of concentration camps, but now you may have 20 concentration camps because both parties increased the amount by 20. And because you started off with one concentration camp less, well, the distribution remains the same, or the difference between the two remains the same. So despite going with the smug idea that, yes, I'm doing one concentration camp less, or yes, I'll take the rapist with the better policies if I'm going to have to deal with 2 rapists, you end up in a situation where the race to the bottom allows for a worsening of your political situation. Elections must be understood over the context of time, not necessarily in any specific narrowed focus. Your country has slid further and further to the right. Part of that has been because the lefties have looked at each race as being more important in putting a Democrat in office and stopping the Republican, as opposed to standing on some level of principle. Meaning in race after race after race, it was almost enshrined as just kind of a way of understanding of political wisdom that the left can always be cowed and scared into falling in line to vote any random Democrat, meaning any notion of accountability is off the table, which also means that basically the ineffectual leaders that you have are basically there because we allowed them to be ineffectual. I'll leave this here. Like, share, and subscribe. Thanks all.